Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Carmen McGuinness, and today I'm going to talk about the differences between familiarity and intimacy and some of the challenges we have in our society in forming real intimate relationships. There's a lot said today in the field of psychology and relationships regarding intimacy. Some definitions of intimacy include a state of extreme interpersonal emotional closeness such that each party's personal space can be entered without causing discomfort. I really like that one. Another is an affectionate or loving personal relationship in which the parties have a deep understanding of one another. I like that one too, and I think together they start to form a comprehensive definition of what we mean by intimacy. But there's more, and we'll go into that here today. So in today's society, generations after the tribe or even the large extended family, there's a deep sense of longing for a sense of belonging or being at home with another person, in particular being at home emotionally. And I underscore emotionally, not physically. Our culture provides for meeting other needs, especially the need for autonomy. We're very good at autonomy in today's society, but intimacy is a little bit harder for us. It's often forgotten in what we look for with a partner, or it's believed, sadly, to be available only to those fortunate few couples. So within the framework of the society and the era in which we live, couples must provide for one another more of the emotional needs that the larger community used to furnish. Often we have no model to follow and no training in what it means or how to be intimate with another person. We may gain familiarity while intimacy eludes us. But why? A widely accepted psychological component of intimacy is very important: the willingness to be vulnerable with another person. So that's that missing component, I think, to those other two definitions: the willingness to be vulnerable with another person. However, this may be more difficult today than ever, because vulnerability requires trust. We live in a world with so few physical boundaries. Cultures and races mix, and that's a wonderful thing, obviously. Girls and boys go to school together and grow up to get equal jobs. That's more good news. Children are permitted access to many activities that used to be reserved only for adults. That's usually good news. And adults are maintaining their ability to be active. They're staying active for longer than ever before, and yay for that. The older I get, the better I think that is. So these are all good things. Inclusion in society. However, inclusion, this kind of inclusion where we're all mixed in and there are so many of us, can cause us to get very good at keeping up boundaries. So with all this physical closeness, perhaps we're getting better and better and better at emotional boundaries. Perhaps so good, in fact, that we confuse familiarity with intimacy. When you think about it, if you're riding home on the train or the bus or just standing in a queue, which we all do several times a day, you're very close to other people, but you don't have physical familiarity with them. But with your family and with your close friends, you do. You hug, you shake hands, whatever it is that you do. So I think we can mistake that as intimacy. It seems like we're intimate with those people. But going back to our definitions of intimacy, we see how it's entirely possible to be familiar with someone without actually being intimate. without actually being willing to let down those boundaries that aren't just physical. Entirely possible to be familiar without affection, to have a deep understanding of each other, to have emotional closeness, to love, or the willingness to be vulnerable. So when this happens, couples in particular can feel isolated and alone in their own homes and in their own relationships. It's said that familiarity breeds contempt, and I would argue that familiarity in the absence of intimacy, where intimacy is appropriate, can certainly build contempt. It can lead to cognitive dissonance, a sense that we're living someone else's life or that we don't even really understand the meaning of what we're doing in this relationship, a sense of meaninglessness, emotional boredom. It can breed infidelity and separation, or if you're married, divorce. And of course, children are often involved. So this all becomes very tricky. What I hope to accomplish in this segment today is, number one, to create a checklist of what you might feel and experience if there's intimacy in your relationship. And I'm going to help you get started with that, with about 4 suggestions. And number two, a few ways to achieve intimacy to help your relationship along to the next step if you feel that you aren't intimate in your relationship and you would like to be. So first, what to look for to see if you are intimacy. How to know if if you are intimate. How to know if your relationship is an intimate one or not. Number one, do you talk? And I mean really talk. Do you talk about your beliefs, your hopes and aspirations? If talk is mostly centered in the past, the personal narrative of the members of the relationship, you probably haven't actually achieved intimacy. Number two, do you make out and have sex, or whatever word you use for that? Or do you also flirt and cuddle and snuggle? These are important components to intimacy. Number three, do you support one another? And I'm talking here about those hopes and aspirations, and in particular where your paths are not exactly the same. Employment is a good example of this. If you're not employed in the same job, then do you share each other's hopes and aspirations regarding employment and support one another in that regard? In-laws and stepchildren is another area where you don't exactly overlap in your hopes and aspirations. Do you support one another in those? And number four, do you talk about things you're likely to disagree on? Remember here, the willingness to be vulnerable is a huge component in intimacy. If you don't feel comfortable discussing those areas where your beliefs aren't perfectly aligned, then you probably haven't achieved intimacy. So there are 4 to get you started answering the question of whether your relationship is an intimate one. I encourage you to do more exploration in this area on YouTube, in writing. Talk to your friends, talk to your family members, speak to your spouse about this, and add to that list. So the second goal of this segment was to give some suggestions for building intimacy in your relationship if you don't feel that you already have it or that it isn't sufficient for you. So the obvious answer here is to do all of the above, right? Do those first 4 things that I mentioned. But that would be cheating and make the video very short. And if you're not already doing those things, then chances are that you might need some help with them. So first, ask yourself if you really trust your partner. And does he or she really trust you? And I'm not talking here just about the stepping out kind of trust. Do you trust them to not cheat on you? Certainly, that's part of it, but I'm talking about something broader than that. I'm talking about, are you willing to show your truest self to him or her? Do you trust them to be vulnerable with them? And is he or she willing to do the same for you and with you? Remember, intimacy is about the willingness to be vulnerable, and that's just not going to happen without trust. If your answer to this question is no or I'm not sure, then you want to ask yourself, is that about him or her, or is it about me? And if it's about you, you have problems trusting, you'll need to do work on that first before you start dropping those boundaries willy-nilly. And that trust work is work about, it may be work about recent relationships that you've had where you had a situation where you lost trust, or it may be deeper work. It may be family of origin work, mommy and daddy work. In this case, I suggest you read up on attachment and trauma, or consider working with a therapist or coach who's trained to address these sorts of issues. If your answer is no, I don't trust him or her, and it's not about me, then you might want to step back and assess whether this is the right person for you. If you feel blocked from some of the areas considered intimate, those that I've mentioned, it may be that he or she is the one who needs to do some of that work before getting serious about another person, and that you need to really step back from that relationship. Many couples marry or take the next step in whatever form, move in together, when one or both of them knows that something isn't quite right, and you definitely don't want to be one of those couples. If the answer is yes, I trust him and he trusts me, but you're just not intimate in the truest sense of the word, then you're just not really talking, flirting, cuddling, snuggling, supporting one another, talking about things you might disagree about, then there are some things you can do to build intimacy within your relationship. Let's talk about them. The first is a frank conversation. If you're both working on building intimacy together, aware of the goals, the moves won't seem so awkward or odd. Now, let me explain that. If you don't talk to your partner about wanting to become more intimate, and all of a sudden you just start flirting or snuggling or talking about matters much deeper than you used to talk about, you might freak him out. He won't know what's going on. He'll wonder what you're doing. So that conversation, that frank conversation, really is a first step. Number 2, take turns. Tell each other one secret you've never discussed before. Agree ahead of time not to judge or condemn each other over that secret, or to criticize each other for not divulging it sooner. Number 3, separately make lists of your dreams and aspirations. And then choose one and take turns telling each other about that dream or aspiration. And then go to another one. And then take turns again and go to another one. And as you do this process, make a Venn diagram. That's where the overlapped diagram, where in the middle is your shared hopes and dreams, and on either side, outside of the shared area of the two circles, are your hopes and dreams that aren't overlapped. Discuss how each of you can support the other in achieving those separate aspirations. And in doing this, be very specific. And, very importantly, be very honest. If your partner suggests something you don't feel comfortable doing, honesty is another huge component. You have to step up and say that. You might think of something else and say, listen, I'm not comfortable doing that, but I could do this to help you out. So number 4, and this one might surprise you, but if you have these conversations on the couch or in bed where you can mix in some of that cuddling and snuggling and flirting that I talked about. It will pair the more difficult conversations with the more pleasant aspects of intimacy, making them easier to get through. And this last one is obvious, and I've kind of alluded to it already. It can be the one that people find the hardest to do, and that's just flirting in everyday life. As you see each other, as you text one another, we tend to make our relationships businesslike the more familiar we become, when really they should be more intimate. You're going to want to wink, you're going to want to touch hands over the dinner table, you're going to want to send those flirtatious texts, you're going to sit next to one another in the booth at the restaurant instead of across from each other, or if you sit next to each other, eye contact, then try sitting across from each other instead. Mix it up a little bit. So there you go. There are 5 suggestions for doing that intimacy work that so many of us just miss in our familiar relationships. I hope this has been helpful. As always, I'm available for more in-depth support if these segments aren't sufficient for your challenges. And I thank you very much for stopping by my channel. I hope your day is sunny and bright and filled with joy.